So this talk is about security metrics, but in reality, I want to answer two questions. The first is going to be, what are good metrics? What are bad metrics? I think we often come up with metrics and then say, this one helps me do something, or this one is a good measure of risk. But we don't have formal definitions for what good metrics are. And the truth is, lots of people have spent a lot of time thinking about this. None of these ideas are really mine. But it's important to synthesize them and apply them in security. I don't think we have, in many senses, done so. And I think the second question I'm going to answer is, what is your next good startup idea? How do you benchmark that? Startup idea in security specifically. Is the microphone good? Is this? Okay, cool. So my name is Michael Roytman. I am the senior data scientist, thank you, for Kenna Security, formerly Risk.io, formerly as in yesterday. And I have access to two large swaths of data. The first swath of data is vulnerability scans that are asset and vulnerability data, fairly live, not very stale, from about 1,000 customers, and that stuff updates, it depends on how the customer sets it, but monthly, weekly, daily. And in the aggregate, I'm looking at about 200 million vulnerabilities across about 1 million assets. So that's the first data set I have to work with. The second data set is a repository of breaches. And during the talk, I'll keep specifying what I mean by breach. I certainly don't mean you lost a lot of money. I mean the technical sense, as in something was exploited successfully. And this data set is about 1.5 billion breach events over the past 2 years. So, Poodle has been exploited something like 600,000 times over the past year. Has any data been stolen with it? Sure. I don't know where or when. This data comes from the SANS ISC Storm Center, Alien Vault Threat Exchange, Dell SecureWorks, VeriSign iDefense, all sorts of threat feed providers. And they usually provide you with threat information like this CVE is being actively exploited. What I have are the successful exploits being launched against IDS systems, and then I take a look at whether open vulnerability existed on that system without any mitigating control, so that the exploitation was successful and actually hit the target. So just keep those two data sets in mind. That's all I'll be using during this talk. And let's start. Metrics are useful because they allow us to design better services or better products. I think Uber is the best example both of a system that uses good metrics and of the emergence of good metrics, which is something that security is faced with in very real time right now. 5 years ago, Uber was not possible. Uber wasn't possible because we didn't have location data about users. So if you think back to 10 years ago, when you would hail a cab, cabs were really efficient. Cabs had excellent operational metrics about how many times a day a driver stopped, how many times they fueled up, what's the average cost per carry, on average, how many customers they picked up per hour. All of those metrics could tell you what a good cab driver was, could help you run a company efficiently. A dispatcher would sit at a terminal and could use those metrics to run a really good operation. And lots of cab companies made throngs of dollars. Now, the reason Uber was able to undercut their costs is because a new data set emerged. That data set was the user's location. No longer did a cab driver have to drive around looking for particular customers to pick up, but they knew where they were. So what changed was the metrics that defined the space also shifted. All of a sudden, you didn't have to talk about just the cab driver when discussing what a good cabbie was, or what the system looked like as a whole. Now you could talk about user satisfaction. How quickly did the user get from point A to point B? Those same metrics about the cab driver became more detailed and more nuanced. You could now say, did the driver take the most optimal route, because we have the data set of all the points and all the routes that they should have taken. This allowed Uber to just be more efficient than their competition. This also allowed them to generate new metrics and automate a new system, that is, automate the system of picking you up. You don't have to have a human driving around looking for people to pick up because we know where people are. And I think that it's a really simplistic analogy, but it's a really good analogy for where security is today. We've had a whole bunch of data, and we've come up with a whole bunch of metrics about how to run an efficient SOC or how to run an efficient vulnerability management practice. But the data sets that underlie that in the past 5 to 10 years, they've shifted. We all of a sudden have data about exploitations in bulk. We have IDS logs in bulk. We have data about which vulnerabilities are being exploited when. We no longer have to rely on a CVSS score to define how important a vulnerability is. And when that happens, when that data set emerges, what we can automate and what we can drive humans away from, I guess, has changed. All of a sudden, I think vulnerability management can be automated. I think intrusion detection has been becoming more and more automated. And as I discuss these metrics, as I come up with some good criteria for them, you'll see that this is really all about automation. I think attackers have gotten pretty good at automation, and I think that's why we're falling behind. Automation as a concept, it's a nice word, but it is only useful insofar as it describes the speed of your practice. It describes the speed of security operations. A bunch of humans can be pretty quick, but they can't be as quick as an automated system. And I think attackers have been onto this for a while. My data indicates that attackers have been using automated weaponized exploits in bulk for a number of years really successfully, not just trying Metasploit modules, but being successful at them. And they're able to shift their strategy much more quickly than organizations are able to shift their strategy. What I mean by shift their strategy is they can decide that an old vulnerability is one they should go after because they've seen successful exploitations on it in the past month and shift all of their resources into automating that. They can create SLAs for their users saying that we know that this will be successful with this probability. By doing so, they don't need a team of 100 engineers to do to come up with new exploits. They can just use old ones in an automated fashion and be very successful. So let's look at how they do that. This is the data set for 2014-2015, all of the vulnerabilities that were successfully exploited. The size of the bubble indicates the number of successful exploitations. The largest of those is around 150 million successful exploitations. Two things are really apparent. The first is that these vulnerabilities, only a small fraction of them account for almost the totality of successful exploitations. Those big bubbles that you see, there's maybe 20 of them, and they are stable, weaponized exploits that are being fired off across the internet, and they're hitting successful for any of a number of reasons. Maybe because the systems are outdated and can't be updated. Maybe because attackers know blocks of the internet where those vulnerabilities, where those exploits are successful. The second thing that becomes really apparent is I don't know if you can see, but the years of those vulnerabilities, other than, think, Poodle, all of those are really old. And they're really old because attackers have figured out what works and they've automated what works. They're not chasing after a Patch Tuesday vulnerability and thinking, oh man, I should write a custom script to exploit this one bank I know of in America. They're thinking, a vulnerability from 2002 has come back with a 3% success rate. I'm going to write a script to attack the entire internet with that and see how I do. That way, I can guarantee that the exploits I'm selling off to people are successful. That way, I can measure my program and I can see, I can calculate an ROI in terms of credit cards. And this trend is persistent if you break down to any small scale. So it's a power law distribution. It's fractal in nature. Any subset of the data that I look at, I see this. So sometimes the vulnerabilities shift which ones are most attacked, but some are constantly there. The trend is the same, though. They're pretty old vulnerabilities, and a small percentage of the vulnerabilities are responsible for a large percentage of the breaches. So if attackers are getting so good at automating things, because you can't fire off 200 million targeted attacks in Q1 of 2014. Those are for sure automated. If they're getting better, we need to get better. So what does that mean for us? Currently in vulnerability management, we have automated vulnerability discovery. What I mean by that is nobody's, scraping through their Windows OS. Everybody's firing off scanners. We have good scanners, and we have scanners that we can fire off in a semi-automated fashion. Sometimes business processes get in the way. Sometimes we're not scheduling those scans to be repeatable. So we're halfway there in terms of how often we scan. But our threat intelligence is incredibly manual. I work with a whole bunch of threat intelligence feeds, and they're super useful in telling you, active campaign on CVE 2013, this. But what does that mean? I'm getting an XML report or a PDF, and I think that's how most people consume new stuff about vulnerabilities. In fact, the entire hype cycle of vulnerabilities that we've seen emerge over the past year is an indication of how manual threat intelligence is, because we need somebody to write an article about Heartbleed to realize that this is a new threat vector that's actually a threat. No, we should have that integrated into our scanning technology. We should know that in an automated fashion so that engineers can respond to it in real time, not read Bloomberg.com to figure out that it's a valuable vulnerability to go after. And our scoring of those vulnerabilities, and this is a consequence of the threat intelligence being manual, is also really manual. So NIST and MITRE do a really good job of coming up with CVSS scores that are descriptive of vulnerabilities, But they do this in an incredibly manual fashion. They evaluate each vulnerability when it comes out, and they decide, what's the exploitability of this thing? What's the confidentiality? And I don't want to say they're wrong sometimes, but it's just that those are point-in-time assessments. Those are not real-time automated ways to score a vulnerability, because that threat intelligence, it would be a huge undertaking for them to A, buy it, B, interpret it and correlate it to those vulnerability scores. And our remediation is, as a result of these things, incredibly manual. So, the number of vulnerability scans that come back with hundreds of thousands of CVSS 10 vulnerabilities are almost all of them. And figuring out which of those vulnerabilities you should remediate first is something that's up to people who are making those decisions. And I don't think there's a consensus about how to do that, You could say this is on a critical asset. You could say, I can fix 1,000 vulnerabilities if I apply this patch, so I should do that. But are you really reducing the risk to your enterprise when you do that? How do you measure that? How do you know that the threat intelligence is indicative of, is confirming your decision? So why are we so manual? And here I'm going to introduce you to a recurring theme in this entire talk, and that is that metrics and automation are essentially the same thing. So we have two requirements to automation, and I'll go into more detail. The first requirement is data. The second requirement is metrics about that data. Once we have those two, we have the secret ingredients to generate automation. So what kind of data do we need? We need base rates for exploitation, because if attackers are increasing the speed at which they attack things, we need to be able to measure that increase in speed and be able to know what it is that they're attacking. We need better data about exploit availability. So Metasploit and Shodan are pretty good. You can buy a Symantec threat feed to figure out what other things have active exploits around them. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. In reality, there's a ton of exploits out there, and the way that we ingest them is we might go to a blog post or a forum and figure out that this CVE now has an exploit available that some black hat hackers are exploiting. The steps that it takes to integrate anything that is a URL into your actual operation are way too slow. It needs to be automated in there. And writing scripts to web scrape is, I think, not automation. There's data about vulnerability trends. So we all read threat reports from a vast variety of sources, and I think people on security metrics and CIRA and in these discussions often try to figure out, what is the ground truth amongst all those reports, which vulnerabilities are actually trending up, and what should we be caring about. But we don't do that in any kind of automated fashion. We read a bunch of PDF reports, we talk about it, and then maybe practitioners come away with some decisions about that. We need better data about those breaches. So the DBIR is awesome. I love the DBIR. I'm its biggest fan. But when a breach occurs and we record that somebody lost $200 million, we have no idea how. I mean, that data is sparse to begin with, but I think it needs to be a priority because that's the only way that we can, not the only way, but that's the best way that we can integrate data, actual loss data, into vulnerability management practices. So in essence, we need this better data because we need better metrics. And so here's kind of quip number 2 about this overall thesis. And it's that we sometimes make bad decisions, but that's because we have bad metrics. Whether or not you enumerate those metrics or not, metrics are decision support for you. Good metrics are just objective functions for automations. But what I mean by metrics are decision support is metrics are a way to convert data into ways that we can make decisions. And we construct metrics about a whole variety of things. In reality, when you make an arbitrary choice between 2 vulnerabilities to patch on Tuesday or 2 vulnerabilities that are 10 years old to patch, you still have some baseline metric or some objective function that you're using to make that decision. And if you stop and think about how you made that choice is a metric that you can probably automate to use in a vulnerability management practice. I'll talk about some of those things, and I'll evaluate some of those things later in the talk. But I think I want at least the Q&A to be super interactive and people to come up with the ways that they make those prioritization decisions. And we'll see if those metrics are good or bad based on a set of criteria. I'll present soon. So, these statements are vacuous and nice, but what actually makes a metric good? It is certainly not the absence of bad, but let's talk about what makes a metric bad first. So when Heartbleed got released, I started tracking exploitations on Heartbleed, and I would see maybe 2 or 3 exploitations per day. Those dots that you see are 3-hour time buckets. And the gap in July and June is actually just missing data. It's not actually a gap. So at the beginning, the rate of exploitation is really low. People are being successful in exploiting Heartbleed once or twice, maybe 3 times per hour. Once we get to the reverse Heartbleed releases, we start seeing tens, dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands of successful exploitations per hour on Heartbleed. Similarly, by that time, we were already fascinated with shell shock, and Heartbleed had kind of gone the way of the media news cycle. But shell shock was seeing those same really low, small numbers of exploitations. And if we zoom out, we can see that when Poodle came out, that was not the case. The way to fire off a successful exploit for Poodle is super easy, and people started doing it in mass in an automated fashion in bulk. This is not a story about those vulnerabilities. This is rather a story about CVSS. And you can see that CVSS is a metric to decide which of those vulnerabilities to remediate. Poodle is a 4.3, Heartbleed is a 5, shell shock is a 10, has no basis in the reality of actual exploitation base rates. But these are the things that we know about. More interestingly are things that we don't hear about. So all of these 4 other vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities that cluster around Heartbleed for me. I took a look at all the breakdowns of the CVSS vector for Heartbleed and found things that match Heartbleed, so information disclosure under CVSS score 5. But the caveat here is that I picked only vulnerabilities that have more successful exploitations than Heartbleed does. And you can see that a 2013 Java runtime vulnerability is pretty often exploited, in the same capacity as Heartbleed. And there's a whole bunch of other ones, but there's a 2001 Windows NT Windows 2000 vulnerability that is exploited literally millions of times, no matter when you look at it. And no media hype cycle has picked that up, and it wouldn't have in 2001 because we just didn't have this data set available. It's impossible to construct a metric around how you capture the successful exploitations of something if you don't have that data. But looking at the data, we can certainly disprove some metrics, and CVSS is one of those metrics. Oh, that went backwards, not forwards. Yes? Yes, absolutely. So what those dots are, what a successful exploitation is one of 2 things. Either an exploit signature was detected on an IDS system, and at the exact same, so I have access to the IDS logs and I have access to the vulnerability scans. And at the exact same time on the system at which the exploit was targeted at, I know that there existed an open vulnerability that was unremediated and had no mitigating control in front of it that matched that exploit signature. So it's entirely possible that nothing happened. It's entirely possible that they compromised not much, or there was 3 more CVs that they had to fire off, but they couldn't. But to train a base rate of whether this vulnerability is one you should care about, this is useful information. The second way that successful exploitations make it into the data set are indicators of compromise found by research teams. So to say that, this malware only gets in via this CVE and we found this payload on this machine, we can estimate that it happened at this hour based on IDS activity. And these come in aggregate from managed service providers and from the Alien Vault OTX. Does that make sense? Is that a fair definition of exploit? Because it's not by any means the commonly accepted definition of a breach. I just think it should be. Yeah, but the question is this exploit going to be successful? Should I close this vulnerability or not? And in that case, if the base rate of exploitation is really high, and you know that Poodle plus 2 other things gets you into a whole lot of trouble, you should probably close it if there's a lot of activity on it. It's more useful in the negative sense, which is to say, this vulnerability that we really thought mattered only has this many exploitations across 100,000 other enterprises. So why are we prioritizing it so high? Why are we spending time remediating it? And of course, this is a probabilistic approach to vulnerability management. There's also the impact-based one. But from where I stand, I know nothing about the impact of exploiting a particular machine. That's something that all the practitioners back home know and should feed into this kind of system. So you think about, first, is this thing going to get exploited? Second, if it does, what happens? And you can slice away a whole lot of vulnerabilities that way. So back to this. CVSS is a metric that doesn't capture exploitability, but it's not the problem. CVSS for prioritization is actually the problem. Because CVSS is used to describe a vulnerability. It's not used as a guide for remediation. The descriptions that it offers of a vulnerability at the point in time in which the vulnerability is released are fairly, fairly useful. So to say that this is an information disclosure vulnerability is a useful attribute of the vulnerability. To say that we know there's a confirmed exploit is a useful facet of a vulnerability. However, that might change over time. For example, a new exploit might come out that when the CVE was scored did not factor into the system, all of a sudden changing how important that vulnerability is, or changing the way that you remediate vulnerabilities. To illustrate this, let's take a look at CVSS as a predictor of breach volume. And what I mean here is, if I use CVSS, can I reliably say that something that is scored highly in CVSS is indicative of something that's exploited often, and something that's scored low is indicative of something that's not exploited very often? So the vulnerabilities that were hit only once or twice in the past year average around a 7.37 on CVSS. And the vulnerabilities that are exploited 100 to 1,000,000 times in the past year average is 7.98. What does that tell us? The difference being so small is actually partially due to two things. The first is that CVSS is not actually a continuous scale. It goes from 0 to 10, but when you look at all the permutations of the formula that are possible, there's only like 16 or 18 different outcomes, and some of them overlap. So in reading the CVSS version 2 changelog, there's a really good tidbit of emails in the exchange. And it says, I think they're looking at the distribution after they've scored all the vulnerabilities, and one of the researchers writes to the other saying, it looks like 9.2 has a lot of data points around it. I'm going to scale it by 0.7 and move 9.41 out a little bit further to, expand the way the distribution looks, because it's nicer that way. And that's what's causing this, right? That's what's causing these, like, everything falls in the same place. There's maybe some slight indication of it being exploited, because it's really an ordinal scale. It has fixed values on it. And those fixed values, the score of them is arbitrarily determined. What actually happened there was they tried to fit a nice distribution to a data set they had. That data set was 2002, I think, and since then it's expanded wildly and out of control of those little scaling parameters. And that's what we're seeing here. Moreover, the things that, the fact that there's only a slight difference between things that are exploited a lot and not a lot means that it's probably binary. It's probably that at the top end of the scale, these things are somewhat indicative of high exploitations, and at the bottom it's not. But it's not that we have the kind of granularity that allows us to make predictions based on CVSS. But that's what we're doing. When we say we should only fix the 8s, 9s, and 10s, we're making a prediction saying that this is the important vulnerability that will end up in a breach. Yes? Well, that's partially true, right? It's both an impact and an exploitability metric.
It's primarily impact.
So an impact metric not being indicative of exploitation rates, what does that mean for us? So so yes, it is severity, but it is also not how often it's occurring, rather how exploitable is it and whether exploits exist, right? So that calculation being point in time in the score is what's causing these problems, I think. That calculation and the way it's modeled also kind of obfuscates the impact metrics. And this is what I was saying earlier, like the fact that it is information disclosure is a useful facet of CVSS. The score is not. That is, the score is scaled by the times that it is exploited or whether an exploit exists at all. And if we don't have information about it, the score isn't scaled. What that means is that whether or not we have reliable data impacts the score, whether or not these exploitations are actually happening impacts the score, but we don't have data factored into the actual equation. But those facets, those descriptions of the data itself, availability, confidentiality, impact, those are really useful descriptions of a vulnerability. And they can be used in decision making. Yeah. So I think, and I gave a talk with Dave Seversky and in the audience about this at RSA. He has a method for doing so called vuln prior. I would advocate it, but I would also say that sometimes you don't need to do that. In that, if you can identify the facet of the point of data that matters for you in decision making, there's no need to take an old score and rescore it if you can say that, how am I going to rescore it? I'm going to say that things that are not, business critical don't matter to me, or things that I know don't have confirmed exploits don't matter to me. There might not be a reason to assign a score to those things. Now, this will become more clear when I talk about Metasploit in particular. My point is, if the scoring metric itself is skewed, and you're augmenting that scoring metric to make it fit your decision-making process better, why not just use your own data and use your own scoring method? So part of the answer is because you already have those scores assigned to every vulnerability, right? That's why you want to skew with change the CVSS score to be more indicative of your practice. But I think an important step in deciding how you do that is to evaluate those pieces of data by themselves. For example, if you evaluate just does a vulnerability have an exploit or not, and think about whether that's a useful metric for your practice, that alone can slice out a huge number of vulnerabilities if that's your decision calculus. Or I don't care about information disclosure vulnerabilities, can slice out a large portion as well without needing to change the score and seeing how it competes with the original formula. Does that make sense? We will get there. Walt? Okay. So, and I think Walt alluded to this, the reason this is important is because attackers... Wait, did that work? Let's see. Is that spinning? The reason that is important is because attackers are changing their tactics daily. So while the CVSS score tries to describe, the vulnerability score by itself, you use this in prioritization and decision making. There's impact metrics, there's exploitability metrics. The truth is what attackers are going after is changing every single week. Is this still spinning? Excellent. What you're seeing here is a week-over-week snapshot of that breach data. At the top are things that didn't enter the data set last week, but are entering it this week. It's logarithmically scaled. At the bottom are things that were in the data set last week, but are not in the data set this week. On the right-hand side are things that are being exploited millions of times, and on the left-hand side are things that are being exploited once or twice. The supposition here is that things that are being exploited in the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of times are automated attacks, and the other ones are targeted. This data set is from around 70,000 organizations, and in this graphic, you're looking at, I think, 600,000 successful exploitations. So what this really tries to drive home the point that if you are trying to describe the probability of exploitation on a particular vulnerability, attackers, when it comes to the really targeted vulnerabilities on the left-hand side, frequently change what they're going after. They don't automate those. They don't write massive deployments of those. They'll fire off a couple and then go after new ones. When it comes to some other ones, they're consistently on the right-hand side and consistently in the picture. They don't enter or exit week over week. And they're constantly being exploited. But they are not necessarily being described because maybe the exploit didn't come out when the CVE was scored. Maybe your scanner ranks it a 5. Or maybe it's an information disclosure vulnerability, but we see many successful exploitations on that vulnerability. So what defines a good metric is essentially just good data. But there's more than that. Let's do a quick thought exercise. Which of these systems is more secure? Why? Okay. Is anybody voting for 2? They're the exact same asset, their just value is different, and they have the same control deployed on it. So, yes, there are 2 answers, and I agree with the first one. It is certainly system 1 that is more secure because it's less of a target, right? The same defenses are implemented, but there's less value at risk here. But that's a philosophical... Yeah, absolutely. I'm saying all things held equal in terms of vulnerabilities and controls, everything about those assets. Fair enough. So the two possible answers are one, which is the one I agree with, because I think of things in terms of risk. And that's a philosophical choice, which is exactly what I was going to say. Saying that both are equal is also a completely valid answer, because that describes the security of the assets, right? There's more value at risk at asset 2, but it's not any more or less secure than asset 1. And you're right, it's probably a semantic obfuscation, but I think it's actually a philosophical choice of how you determine those asset computations. Whether you want to incorporate that value at risk, or whether you think that what matters are the controls, is the actual security of the assets. And this distinction, this maybe semantic, maybe philosophic distinction, is also the distinction in types of metrics that I want to talk about. There are type 1 metrics that exclude the real-life threat environment. That is to say, those two assets are equally secure. The occurrence rate of actual exploitations or the value at risk is controlled. And there are type 2 metrics which define the interaction with the threat environment. So to say that asset 1 was more secure was to use a type 2 metric implicitly, was to say that the value at risk there is lower and hence it is more secure. To say that they are equally secure is to exclude the real-life threat environment. I'm not making a value statement about either one of these types of metrics. Both are completely valid and both are absolutely necessary in a security practice. So let's illustrate that. A type 1 metric is something like, there's some of these malware or these phishing firms that will send out a phishing email to your entire corporate office and then see how many bite. And then you get a return rate of 23% clicked on this link, so 23% of my employees would fall for a phishing attack. That's not true. That has a controlled occurrence rate and a crafted message, and that is really useful in determining which of those people in the organization might be susceptible to that kind of risk, but that's not the real-life threat environment. Type 1 metrics are useful in getting a base rate of how your system will interact in the abstract. Type 2 metrics are useful in saying, I am measuring something about the world. I'm measuring the number of loss events or the number of exploitations that have happened on those vulnerabilities. A better example of a type 1 metric is the CVSS score. It is in the abstract saying this vulnerability is maybe this at risk or poses this much security. And a type 2 metric would be something like, which percentage of my vulnerabilities have a Metasploit module out in the wild? And that's the real-life threat environment that those vulnerabilities interact with. Combining those two metrics, combining the impact of the CVSS score metrics that it describes and the real-life threat environment in which those vulnerabilities exist, is what gets you to good metrics. And I don't think that you can run a good practice without both. I think that they're essential to both. In the first half, and I think this was Walt's contention, and this was your contention as well, I'm talking only about interaction with the threat environment metrics. They're missing something essential. They're missing the controlled occurrence rate descriptions of the environment. And when we add those on, we can do a lot better. So there are actually some really accepted definitions of what makes a good metric, and I expect that there will be some debate about these as well. There was a really good conference maybe a year ago in Germany about security metrics in particular, and it had an add-on about metrics in general, and I kind of read through all those papers and found out what it is that people are using to describe good metrics and bad metrics, and this is kind of all of that literature review together. There are a few things that describe a good metric. The first is that it needs to be bounded. You can't make decisions on unbounded metrics because there's always two things that could fall above the bound, and then you can't make prioritization or competing decisions about them. The second is that it needs to scale metrically. That is to say, we need to know the difference between a score 9 and a score 10 and be able to articulate that difference. As a result of the way in which CVSS maps to scores, it is not metrically scaled. I think it is possible to create something that is metrically scaled. It is possible to make the claim that we've constructed metrically scaled scoring systems. A really simple example of a metrically scaled scoring system is binary, because 0 is the absence of it and 1 is it exists. Objective, valid, and reliable are mathematical definitions for those metrics. That is to say, with the same inputs, you get the same outputs. The inputs map to different outputs, and reliability is to say that if the underlying data set shifts, then the function that determines the output of that metric is consistent. 6 is a little tricky, which is to say context specific, and I think that's my beef with CVSS. That is, when you use it for prioritization, it's not a metric for prioritization. It's not contextually constructed to make prioritization-based decisions because metrics are decision support. And yet people are using it in that way. When we say CVSS is a good metric, it might be a good metric for describing a vulnerability or describing the impact of it if we mine out those first three things. And the seventh one I added on myself, which is to say it needs to be computed automatically. It'll become apparent in an example as to why automatic computation is necessary, but I think automatic computation is necessary because you want to be able to make decisions with those metrics, and in the world of security, if your decisions aren't automated, you're a little too slow. Yes?
So the point 6 becomes more context specific. We scored a lot of things based on what your asset, where your asset is, it's not all this stuff. What are the other variables to run to make mistakes?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think so you should definitely sync up with Dave Seversky after, because he has a framework for doing so. And you could also make CVSS metrically scaled if you just assign meaning to those differences. If you say that the 9.21 and the 9.43 in CVSS mean these things for my organization, then you've essentially made it metrically scaled. And so the best way to illustrate these is to go through a couple of them. Here's one. And I also want this to be interactive. So mean time to incident discovery is a metric a lot of people use. Do people think this is a good or bad metric? Like, forget these things. Forget getting into the nitty-gritty of it. Is that a useful metric for a security practice? Why not? Absolutely. Is your organization getting better because the mean time is decreasing, or are there less threats or less vulnerabilities out there? Is it easier to detect them? Are the tools better? So I think that measures something, but I don't think it measures your team over time. Or you fired 2 people. And so less people are doing detection and they're slower. I think that you can have a much more contextually specific metric, but I think over time a lot of metrics become more useful as well. Mean time to incident discovery, in my opinion, is a bad metric because it's not bounded. So like it could be infinity days, and it often is like 273 days until you've discovered something. And when you think about the mean time to incident discovery, that's not very useful because it's possible that you just weren't looking for a particular vulnerability. It's like the unemployment rate. People who aren't engaging in the job market aren't counted in it, but maybe that's because they're past their unemployment benefits and no longer looking for it. So you could have a mean time of incident discovery of 10 days and have found vulnerabilities in the first day 100 times and then found vulnerabilities in the 20th day 100 times. And you can also have a mean time of incident discovery of 10 days where you're pretty good on average, but there's one vulnerability that took you a year to find. And I think that that happens often. The range of those things is really large. I disagree. I think that if you're using that metric to determine how many people you should hire, you're making the assumption that your time will get reduced. Absolutely. So a problem with that, a problem with using that metric to decide how much automation you need, is that you can't compute that metric automatically for every incident response. Because if you could compute it automatically, you would have discovered the vulnerability to begin with. Right? If there's an automated way to say this is when the vulnerability entered the system and this is when we discovered it or found the incident. When the incident occurred and then when the incident was discovered. If there's an automated way of doing that, then you would have detected the incident.
What about the case where knowing that the incident happened, you find out about it here, you can track what you know here back to initial detection. So you wouldn't have been able to find out about it here
Okay, so like a bit 9 carbon black type of solution, where like you found that you walk backwards to where it happened.
Yeah.
Sure, I suppose that makes sense, but that means that every time you're finding.
It doesn't make this metric any better. It just, you need the 7 go to check mark.
But wait, if you could walk back to it, wouldn't you just be, so the next time this incident occurs, you would detect it automatically, right? Because you found the way that it got in.
So instead of saying that, say that, so you start with a whole bunch of things that happen. And you subset, until you go like, this is the thing that's bad. Out of all the things that happen. Once I know this was the thing that was bad, I can go back and say this was the thing out of that whole subset that was important. Now, the next time something happens, it's different IP or whatever, I'm still going to have to do that same funnel again until I can decide this incident wasn't incident. And walk my way back when it initially occurred.
So that brings up another issue, right? If you can do that and you can walk back and discover the thing that caused it, then the next time that exact same incident occurs and you're trying to use that metric over time, you can automatically say, this bad thing is happening, I've detected it in 0 time. Isn't that the point of systems like that, to figure out, like, this is what was causing it, let's create a rule around that system so we no longer have to worry about it?
Let's say we use the IP to track that. They're going to use a different IP next time. So I can't say, hey, the IP encryption. But when I figure out that IP was bad or wasn't acting in malicious conversation, I can track back to what I initially began the conversation where the attack path started.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. Is that doable in an automated fashion? Like every time there's an incident?
Correlate on that feedback across.
That makes sense. What's a more useful metric for incident discovery? I don't work in incident discovery at all. I'm evaluating these metrics in a very abstract way.
One is really discovering the implication, which I heard on, and the other is actually discovering I've got a profile rather than
You mean the difference between like an IP discovery incident, bad IP got in, and this was the attack vector?
Right.
Yeah, I think when I conceptualized this, I was definitely talking about the exploitation, the attack vector, not what I think both of you are describing here, which is like, this is the malicious attacker. What's the time to discover the attacker?
Right. See, that's an important distinction from looking at cases. Really playing the card that lets you then create balance. So from your perspective, you're talking about discovery. I agree with you because you're going to make a decision. But instead of again, vulnerability method, which is asset attachment, how do I know? Now I've got that.
So I definitely agree with the context delineation that you made, but I still don't think that the metric is in any way more bounded than it was before. Right? Like, what does it mean to have a good? Does it mean if you're good in that other context, in your context of it, does that mean that you're just decreasing over time? Yeah, but like, so at a point in time to say 250 days is the mean time to incident discovery. What does that say about an organization? But does it? I don't know. Like maybe some vulnerabilities take years, some incidents take years to discover, but on average we're doing, at the top end of the quantiles we're doing pretty well. So I completely agree with your distinction. right? I think that the different metrics are necessary to measure both of those. I just think that both of those metrics, and the point of this is just to illustrate that mean time to incident discovery, it's not bounded in terms of the metric itself. Like it can grow infinitely. And by growing infinitely, it's a bad metric. Maybe, so like a really good way to do this is to say, of the incidents we've captured in the past 60 days, are we doing faster or slower? And then that metric is all of a sudden, of the incidents that pertain to exploitations in the past 60 days, how many have we captured? Is that trending over time? Yeah. Go ahead.
Something that's suspiciously absent on this list is robust. Like, I noticed you're using routine, and like that could be affected easily by like just a really bad incident. Like, you were just changing it to medium. That seems like it would be, I'm not saying that would be a good measure.
It'd be way better. That's the X on valid. I completely agree with you.
Okay, so that's okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's a valid metric because multiple inputs into that metric can produce the same output that's not descriptive of the actual system state, which is what you're saying, the median or the top 10. So I think actually like something like the uppermost quantile is a better description because we want to be good in the cases where we capture them quickly. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why it might take a year to capture something. But there's only a few as to why we're good. Or looking at both the top and the bottom quantile are useful metrics. So away from incident discovery, and caveat, I don't know much about anything except vulnerabilities. This is an important context for this. Let's talk about some other metrics. The point is to show that this framework, and I think we've done that in this discussion, is to show that thinking about these 7 things, maybe there's more things, maybe there's less things, allows us to have a discussion about whether the metrics make sense, how can we make them better, and that applies to all sorts of metrics, not just security metrics. Certainly vulnerability metrics. This one I know something about. What do people think about scanning coverage as a metric for vulnerability management in the context of vulnerability management? Does anybody actually use scanning coverage as a metric? Yeah.
But it makes an assumption that you actually know everything that you got out there.
Absolutely.
This is actually a tenant that has tenants. And when you start talking about the conversation you stood up yesterday, and when we talked about metrics before, and brought up the briefing today was you've got to actually have, when you talk about dashboards, you actually need to put them in the context where they actually deliver a story when they send a message, right?
Absolutely. So in the abstract, vulnerability scanning coverage doesn't mean a thing.
It's not bounded. It has no bounds. It has no capability to really scale.
But if you have asset inventory and you say of these 1,000 assets, yeah, of course. But I think that there are sections of businesses that do have accurate asset inventory.
That is a false assumption and probably what 99% of organizations. I have yet to come across a single organization of sufficient size and complexity that has an accurate enough data inventory. By sufficient size and complexity, I'm talking about a 50-person company that's a SaaS provider. I'm not talking about a huge Bank of America who is still listening and they don't know what's actually on the line. They can't tell you everything nor do they know what it's used for.
Okay, so that's fair. Back to this framework then. I think it matches all 7 of these. What is missing?
Context.
So you think this metric isn't context specific because the underlying data that it's trying to describe is shifting, or we don't have a good description? Well,
It's bounded on the between.
it's bounded by your assumption, right?
It's bounded by some assumption, and context specific is assumption factor.
Okay, I think that's fair. So does that mean the? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to build on what you was saying. I love it, Michael. I want to challenge this framework. You do not believe the usefulness of the metric. The assessed is going to be the metric. The assessed from the point of view of the people, the systems trying to make decisions. So, when I look at this metric, a organization, I would say
helps us learn, guide some decisions, like how we need to beef up our inventory. So maybe it's not about vulnerability scanning at all. Let's put our effort into getting better inventory in particular ways. Maybe
That makes
it's
sense.
about staffing decisions. So mean time might inform staffing decisions in ways that other metrics cannot. Looking at mean time for remediation and protection might get you started to look on the distribution and help you discover which vulnerabilities or incidents were never found in the first place. So while you can look retrospectively at metrics and say, well, it has nice properties because of these, I don't think it informs whether or not the metric is actually really useful in a context.
So not a response to that, but I think the way that I mean these are necessary insufficient criteria for a good metric. I want to disagree with the fact that, like, you said mean time to incident discovery or vulnerability discovery can be useful to start a conversation about whatever. I think something like median bounded time to incident discovery can be just as useful in starting a more robust conversation if it matches these necessary insufficient criteria. So I think you're correct in saying that there's other criteria for these metrics. And I think context specificity is one of the most important ones. That's my whole harp with CVSS in this discussion. But I think if a metric fails these tests, we ought to rethink that metric or reject it. Not that, so this is a really good example. The vulnerabilities covering coverage maybe passes, in my opinion, but it doesn't because it's not context specific in other scenarios. Yeah. So do we think that a temporal component to evaluating a metric is useful? And I think Russ's point is that metrics are useful in the object observer system, not by themselves. But I think some of what we're trying to do in these discussions is define how they interact with the observer system. Right? You guys are the observers of these metrics in the real world, and we're trying to define how they're interacting. So I think if we can come up with criteria as to what makes it more likely to be successful, that's useful. So I have like a minute, no minutes. Let me jump ahead. So one of the most interesting things here is that metrics about, so bringing it back to CVSS, there's a lot of data contained in there, and there are metrics within it that are useful by themselves, that are valid by themselves and pass all of these tests. For example, the binary choice of does something have an exploit or not passes all of these tests and is context specific to prioritization, because when you try to prioritize vulnerabilities, that is part of what you're trying to describe. You're describing what is the probability that I'll get hit on that vulnerability. It avoids the ordinal scale of the CVSS. It's bounded, it's metrically scaled. Metrics that are using information in the way that it's in the way that it's supposed to be used. Like Russ said, like, what is the context? How does it interact with the system? I think there are some metrics like, does a Metasploit exist in a vulnerability? What is the percentage of Metasploit exploitable vulnerabilities in my environment that do those things, that are useful not just because they are valid metrics, but because they're contextually specific to the task at hand. I'm going to post these slides afterwards. We're out of time. There's some data about how these metrics perform and how they capture those data sets of successful exploitations. So like Metasploit being present on a vulnerability, much better indicator of being in that data set or the probability of exploitation on an open live vulnerability in those vulnerability scans than a CVSS score by itself is. But you can leaf through those. There's some nice graphs afterwards. And I guess the whole point of the talk is that if we can come up with criteria for what justifies a good metric, and this is what I meant from the beginning about your good startup idea, is that once we can agree on a good framework for what defines a good metric, because our data sets have shifted and they generate new metrics, we can also use those metrics to create automation systems, to create products that will make our jobs much easier. And unless we have a standard type of definitions or a standard framework for defining is this metric good or bad, we're going to keep coming up with multiple vendors spinning out different metrics that are not necessarily tested by the community. So I think I'm really glad there was a discussion here. It's an open challenge to the community to come up with a feasible framework for evaluating these metrics. Fair to say mine is insufficient. It requires more context, but let's come up with that context. And then you can look at a vendor and say, this is a useful dashboard. This is not a useful dashboard. This is something I should automate in my practice. This is something that requires human effort. That's it.